Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Lynn Abramson, the president of the Clean Energy Business Network, and we're thrilled to have Doug Rand here today with us. He is the former Assistant Director for Entrepreneurship at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy under the Obama administration. And we've been delighted to collaborate with Doug as well as a variety of other nonprofit and industry groups to begin looking into the federal small business research and development programs, specifically the Small Business Innovation Research Program, and to look at some potential improvements to make these incredibly valuable programs even more accessible and useful to the small businesses for which they are intended. So I'm going to go through a little bit of background on why we are engaged in this process, the next steps for involvement, before we turn it over to Doug to provide an overview of these programs and some potential ideas for reform. So just as a background on the Clean Energy Business Network, for those who are not familiar with our organization, the CEBN is the small business voice for the clean energy economy. And we work to amplify opportunities for small businesses working as clean energy technology and service providers, and we do this in three areas. One is in policy support, provide information and opportunities for businesses to engage in policy issues that impact market opportunities for their technologies. The second is in market and technology education, so we provide resources to help businesses across multiple sectors learn about and engage in new market transformations across the industry. And we also disseminate information to the public and policymakers to promote greater understanding and support for clean energy technologies. And then the final area is in business development. We work to aggregate useful information to support small businesses, such as funding opportunities, events, and opportunities to network with partners. And we also work leverage our nationwide network of more than 3,000 members to promote connections across the industry with potential funders, collaborators, and partners. This is an overview of some of the methods that we've used to accomplish these goals, and I'm not going to get into this in great deal, but basically we serve to try to provide a voice and amplify the opinions of small businesses across the nation that might not otherwise have much of a presence in Washington or in their state houses. And we've achieved really significant wins in the past few years on clean energy funding, tax, and infrastructure policy, and we're delighted by this opportunity to engage on the potential improvements to small business programs. That's really a niche area that's specifically within our wheelhouse as we represent primarily small businesses. So our process for engaging in this proposal is we began discussing some of these proposed ideas with Doug and with other nonprofit and trade partners within our network here in DC, based on some of the feedback we have been hearing over the years. So Doug has, he can speak a little bit more about his background in a moment, but he has extensive experience working with some of these programs, both as a small business owner himself, as well as a former OSTP official, and had some thoughts on ways to streamline the process for navigating these programs. Additionally, we hear quite a lot of feedback from our members as we frequently are flagging recommended funding opportunities for specific members and saying, you should consider applying for this. And we hear a lot about their experiences working with these programs and feel that we would like to try to help make this process a little bit easier and make it easier for small businesses to access programs. So we began at the staff level developing some of these ideas. Really, Doug, I take much of the credit for coming up with these proposals, and we provided some input on that. Then we had an initial round of discussions with a group of members within our network who we were aware of had received small business innovation research grants, as well as various incubators around the country that have supported some of these entrepreneurs. And we collected more detailed feedback on their specific experiences, having worked with various federal agencies, as well as their feedback on the proposed reforms. And we've used that to develop a draft sign-on letter, which I'll talk about in a moment. Today we're holding this webinar for several reasons. One is to inform businesses who are not yet very familiar with these programs about what they are, what their goals are, how to apply, and then to walk through some of our proposed reforms. And I apologize, there are going to be some text-heavy slides here, but it's because we felt that we needed to really put everything on paper for folks to understand and process a little bit as you follow up from this webinar. Immediately upon conclusion of this webinar, you're going to be receiving an email in your inbox with a couple of important links into it, and this is going to provide your opportunity to engage. So there's a survey, I'm going to talk more about that in a moment, a sign-on letter, and we are going to use all of this to inform our final recommendations for policymakers, which we'll be submitting via testimony to Congress, the letter to Congress, and meetings with federal agency and congressional officials. And then hopefully next year, as we continue down the process of negotiating specific legislative changes as well as executive branch actions, we can bring some of you here into Washington to actually meet with policymakers and discuss your views on these issues. So how to specifically engage, I'm going to get to in a few moments after the conclusion of this presentation, but do keep an eye out in your inbox at the end of the webinar and on the links that are provided there. I will also note that we are recording this webinar, and we will be following up with the slide deck and the recording so that you can digest all of this information in more depth and follow up with any additional feedback or questions for us via email. So with that introduction, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Doug Rand, who's going to walk us through the background on some of these programs as well as our ideas for making them more accessible.
Thank you, Lynn. Thanks everyone for joining today. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today, and it's been terrific working with Lynn and the rest of the team at the Clean Energy Business Network. Before I launch into this presentation, which is going to be focused on both, what is this program, how is it relevant for your business, and then how could it be better, just a quick point on why this matters now. There's just a lot of interest right now on Capitol Hill in these programs. I mean, there's always interest, but in just the upcoming month, there's going to be a hearing at the House Small Business Committee. There's going to be some, a bill probably formally voted out of committee on the Senate side. There's always opportunities and interest in the Armed Services Committees in both chambers, because the DoD is a big part of this program. So it's actually very timely to be working on this right now.
And of course the appropriations bills, which also provide some context for managing these programs as well. Yeah. So just so everybody has a sense that Lynn is doing a really great job kind of keeping her finger on the pulse of what's going on here in Washington, and really looking for great opportunities to have a meaningful impact on funding potential for your companies. So just quick overview, the SBIR program, which stands for Small Business Innovation Research, started by Congress way back in the early 80s. It was actually initially piloted at the National Science Foundation, and it's grown to become the federal government's biggest annual funding opportunity that's available exclusively to startups and small businesses. There's certainly plenty of other funding opportunities from the federal government, but this one, you've got to be a small business to apply. Overall, we recently went above the $3 billion mark. So in the last fiscal year, over $3 billion was awarded to 3,600 different small businesses. The overall program is monitored and coordinated by the U.S. Small Business Administration. However, the actual funding opportunities and awards are administered by 11 other federal agencies that actually conduct federal R&D. And the way this works is that Congress basically says, look, if you are a federal agency and you do research and development, you need to set aside 3.65% of your extramural R&D budget. In other words, the R&D budget that's going outside the four corners of your agency to universities or to federal contractors or what have you. And so 3.2% of that money goes to SBIR awards, which is basically a grant directly to a small business. There's also a kind of
different flavor of this program called Small Business Technology Transfer, which gets a smaller allocation. That STTR just means, it's still a small business that gets the award, but they split it with a university partner, usually 70-30. For purposes of this presentation, for simplicity, I'm just going to call all of this SBIR, even though there's this sub-program called STTR as well. So where is this money? People talk about the SBIR program. It's really 11 different programs, and you might argue it's a dozen more on top of that if you want to really get down to the weeds of the DoD. But basically, there's 5 major agencies that comprise the overwhelming majority of the money. So the Department of Defense is about half the dollars. NIH is about a third of the dollars. And then coming in at about $200 million each, you've got the Department of Energy, the National Science Foundation, and NASA. And then there's a bunch of much tinier programs at places like the USDA, DHS, Commerce, Transportation, Education, and the EPA. So, what makes these awards special? First of all, the agency has to spend these, grants these awards to small business. Small business has to spend almost all of the award on R&D expenses. So you can't spend it on building a factory or, refurbishing your office or hiring a marketing director or what have you. But this can include if you're hiring engineers or other technical staff. The funding is non-dilutive. In other words, it's a grant. The federal government does not expect any upside, not taking a stake in the company. And the awards are divided into multiple phases, all focused on commercializing new technologies, bringing them to market. So the most important 2 phases are phase 1, where if you're successful, you get between $150,000 and $225,000, usually for a performance period of 6 to 12 months, and that's really to establish initial technical feasibility and commercial potential. If you're successful in your phase 1, then odds are better that you'll get a phase 2. A phase 2 award can be $750,000 to $1 million. The period can last up to 2 years, and that supports further tech R&D and commercialization efforts. Now, after that, there's the possibility of other phases. So in some agencies, there's something called phase 2B, notably at the National Science Foundation, which is saying, well, after you've finished your phase 2, if you can get private capital from a venture capitalist or other source, NSF will match that 1 to 2. And so you can get another $1.5 million in total between the public and private funding. Just last year, Congress basically mandated that all agencies need to do some version of this. So that's a really good opportunity coming up. You'll also hear people talk about phase 3, which is, I always feel like kind of a bit of a misnomer. There is no one phase 3. Phase 3 really refers to any money you get after you're done with SBIR. So it can include venture capital. It can include, corporate, small business partnership deal. It can include anything in the private sector. I think most notably, when it comes to government resources, it refers to a government agency providing either additional R&D that's not part of the SBIR program or sole source procurement for an agency mission. So if the DoD wants to buy your thing and put in a weapon system, or NASA wants to buy your thing and put it in a spacecraft, we'll call that phase 3. And in general, Congress has provided for a lot of basic advantages for SBIR funded companies to kind of get a leg up on procurement processes. Okay, how do you apply for one of these things? First of all, remember, there's 11 different agencies putting out funding notices at different times every year. So you've got to be on top of that. One thing I noticed that's a little counterintuitive, if you go to sbir.gov, which is the official government website, they give you a little warning saying, actually, you need to go to every agency website and don't rely on this whole of government website. And believe it or not, there's actually a private sector consultant. I put the web address here. It's called ZYN Systems. That has not very beautifully designed, but extremely useful breakdown of okay, here's all the agency homepages you need to be monitoring, including, interestingly, every single component of the Department of Defense. So if you just look at the Air Force, Army, Navy, they each have SBIR programs that are about the size of NSF. And then, if you dig down even deeper, Special Operations Command has its own SBIR solicitation. DARPA has its own, and so on and so forth. So again, it takes a little bit of legwork, but it's worthwhile to keep an eye on any of these agencies that you think might be a match for the R&D that you want to do. And again, like some agencies only do one a year, so you really got to be on it. Some of them do 2 a year. I've heard from NSF they're working on doing rolling applications, which would be pretty awesome, but that hasn't happened yet.
I will say part of what we're trying to do is we aggregate in our funding database. We don't cover every single one of these, I would say, but we are regularly checking all the funding opportunities for at least DOE, DOD, EPA, NIST, and NSF, because those are the ones most relevant for our members. So
right.
And then the general portal. So we can help do some of this work.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, NIH is probably going to be less relevant for your members.
Right.
They're mostly trying to look to put through clinical trials.
Exactly.
That's kind of how NSF and NIH divvy up the world. Oh, which is a good segue to how do you apply? So here, again, the agency really matters. So if you're looking at NSF, we deliberately make the research topics really broad. I mean, if you look at, this is a screen grab just from the NSF website. It basically says, hey, here's the list of topic areas we fund. And if you look at the list, it's basically everything. I mean, if your technology doesn't require a clinical trial, and therefore, is an NIH project, NSF's probably interested. And they see, even with this giant list of scientific arenas, if you feel your company is a good fit, but doesn't apply to one of these, you can apply under the other topics category. So basically what they're saying is, here's a list of things we're interested in and we have expertise in, but hey, feel free to surprise us. Contrast that with the DoD approach. So here's this, screen grab from, this is one topic from like a multiple 100-page list of topics that the DoD put out last time, entitled, I can't actually read on my screen, Remote Optical Surface Contaminant something, 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 with like this very detailed description, exactly what they want to see out of the phase 1 and phase 2, and dual use in 3, like exactly what they want to ultimately integrate it into a DoD system, and so this is a much more traditional, like, kind of procurement-oriented solicitation that just happens to be for small businesses. So, it's not awesome for an entrepreneur who's like waking up every morning working on a technology that you chose and that you are, very, very single-mindedly trying to commercialize. The NSF approach is a lot more welcoming, but, sometimes it can be worthwhile to look at these more, super narrow gauge topics and see, hey, can I shoehorn what I already want to do into something that the DoD is asking for? It just takes more legwork.
Do you feel like the DOE on that spectrum, is it sort of in the middle?
DOE is somewhere in the middle, yeah. It depends. I mean, and ARPA-E kind of has its, ARPA-E is separate from DOE. They do their own thing. So ARPA-E, basically, anytime they do a solicitation world, there's like a small business set aside for it. Mm-hmm. But the rest of DOE, yeah, they tend to get fairly narrow, probably not as narrow as DOD. I would say that NSF is kind of leading the field in terms of flexibility on that front. Okay, so how do you apply? And this list is my very short summary of my own experience, because after I was a policy person talking at things at the 50,000 foot level, I started a new company a couple of years ago and decided, hey, I'm going to start, I need to walk the walk here and see what's it really like to apply. So I will tell you in nitty-gritty detail, using just a few bullet points, how it works. So first, it's always a good idea to get early feedback from the relevant program manager. So most agencies, at least before the solicitation hits the street, are very willing to talk to anybody. So their contact information is public. So if you're like, oh, I want to apply to NSF in the AI field, talk to them, see if you're barking up the right tree or not. They're usually pretty helpful and candid.
And you're saying after the solicitation's out, then they have more restrictions?
It depends on the agency. In some cases, certainly after you submit, all bets are off.
We've seen that a lot of times when it's harder to talk to them because, and it's not out of an unwillingness to help, but it's that they can't give
conflict of interest.
Yeah, exactly. They can't give any information to one applicant that might make them more successful than another applicant. So you're saying look at the programs that, broadly speaking, could be relevant to your technology and have an initial conversation okay.
I mean, I'll tell you, plenty of other companies are doing it, so don't let them have an unfair advantage. Then before you apply, there's all these hoops you have to jump through that I found remarkably time-consuming, so just fair warning, like our company didn't have a DUNS number. You have to get a Dun & Bradstreet number or you can't apply.
What is that?
You know, Dun & Bradstreet is this company that for, you know, decades has had like a kind of hash for ID number service, and there's a lot of like lenders and things that require it. So I mean, it's just one of these things that you never think you have to get, but then you do. Then the federal government has something called the System for Award Management, or SAM, which is, you know, not the most thrilling technology platform to register for, but you got to have a SAM registration. And you know, again, like you got to deal with these things ahead of time, because if you wait till the last minute, you could be in big trouble because they could take weeks. It's good to like to jump on teeing up letters of recommendation, so that can help make an application more appealing. And so, for example, you know, we were looking to commercialize something that had, you know, some near-term real-world impacts, and so we got letters of recommendation from potential partners down the road who were excited about it. Then comes writing up the actual proposal, and it's an academic exercise. Like I think ours was 50 pages long. You know, it's no joke, and it feels much more like you know, applying for an academic grant than it does, you know, pitching a venture capitalist. So that said, like it's very common for small businesses to hire a consultant who's done hundreds of these. You know, I never thought I was going to do that, but at the end of the day, I did hire a consultant just to take like a last look at our application and like kind of set up with, you know, language that the agency would take to better. But you can also hire a consultant for more money to write the whole thing with your input. So it's worthwhile thinking about that option and knowing you're not alone, even though it can be painful to owning up for consulting fees. You submit the proposal, and then this is one of the downsides of the program versus like, you know, VC. I think with VC, it's kind of like you spend months and months and months and months and months and months knocking on the doors and trying to like get to yes, but then once you get to yes, it comes together pretty quickly. Whereas SBIR is the opposite. Like, you know, like what the deadline is. There's a very transparent process for the money, but then once you apply, it can take several months to get a decision. And then even if you win, it can take several more months to actually get the funding release. And then once you get the funding, I didn't put this bullet on, like, you know, there's all these requirements for tracking performance and accounting and stuff like that. They can be somewhat onerous for a small business. Full disclosure, we did not get the award, so I've never had personal experience of actually, you know, during the performance period. It's doable, but it's just like extra overhead that I think most small businesses wouldn't otherwise have to deal with. Still, that said, you know, for the winners, it can be really worthwhile because it is non-dilutive capital. It is like a technical seal of approval from a federal government agency, and down the road, it can like, you know, ease the way towards both public-private match if it's NSF, or, you know, actual acquisition if it's the NASA, and to a lesser extent DOE. So that,
yeah, and I will say, as far as the ones we've spoken with in our network, the businesses that have gotten these awards, or really any federal R&D award, it was pretty transformative for all of them, because as you said, it's a technical field. A lot of venture capitalists don't necessarily have the technical acumen, they have the business, and so then it's already been sort of, the technology's been somewhat vetted. A lot of them have, a lot of the folks that we've spoken to have gotten multiple rounds of awards. It's not just the first one, they've gotten subsequent awards. So, you know, if you can deal with all of the hoops, it's really very impactful.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, being able to say, I mean, in some ways, this is like free technical peer review from, you know, a really prestigious federal agency. And so, if you go through that peer review and you win, that says that you're not, you know, creating a perpetual motion machine at the least, and at most says you're doing something really promising. So that's the general overview. Do you want to hold questions till the end, Lynn?
I've actually been, I chat to everyone. People can chat their questions at any time, and then we can go over them either in the moment if it makes sense or at the end. So far, we haven't gotten any questions, but if anyone has a question or as we get to the recommendations, a comment, we welcome that. So you can just scroll to the chat button and send that to us. We do it so that it's not chaos with many people talking all at the same time.
Got it. Okay. Cool. So yeah, please do send in any questions about the nature of the program itself. But I'm going to segue into, ways that the program could be even better. And I'll start with things that Congress can do. Now, just to kind of delve a little bit into the wonky policymaking details, Congress is always looking for opportunities to improve the program by writing, new laws. They typically direct the Small Business Administration to then direct the federal agencies to do something different from what they're already doing. But a lot of progress happens at the agency level with or without Congress, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So what we tried to do is, based on knowledge we already have, looking at this program, participating in this program, and many conversations with CEBN members and other small businesses, tried to come up with a kind of list that Hill staffers and members of Congress can really use to prioritize. So that's why it's at this kind of nerdy level of detail. If we just said, make it better, make it easier, make it faster, that's easier said than done. So we're trying to help convey like a sense of prioritization and a sense of like nitty-gritty detail. So,
and I'll also say, just to your point,
yeah.
While Congress can direct a lot of these things, some of these things can happen administratively.
That's right.
And I know in our meetings with federal agency officials, they are constantly looking for input on ways that they can improve implementation of programs. And the more specific we get on that, the more helpful it is to them. So, but part of the reason we're having this conversation today is we want to present these ideas to the folks on the call, and then also get your feedback. And I'm going to talk at the end a little bit about how you can provide your feedback on which of these ideas resonate most with you and which ones you agree with the most.
Got it. Thanks, Lynn. The first one here, I think, is a good example of something that's like nerdy but important. So historically, the way SBIR worked is Congress basically gave an unfunded mandate to the agencies. It said, okay, NSF, NASA, DOD, other agencies, you got to carve out this money for your small business program, but then every single dollar you're carving out has to go to a small business. So you can't, there's no overhead percentage. You have to basically, we're basically saying, you've got to take this money, whether it's $200 million at NSF or $1 billion at DOD, and you've got to, run a process to get it out to the small businesses, but you got to pay for the personnel and the IT and everything else based on other budget. You can't dip into the SBIR dollars for anything. And, there's an argument that was, that's good for small businesses and there's more money available, but since 2011, when Congress allowed agencies to take just 3%, for overhead, which is like a couple $1 million, out of a couple $100 million in most agencies, the agencies have used it for really useful things. Agencies, I think have really good civil servants working on these programs by and large, and so they were able to use this overhead to do a lot of good things. So we've seen dozens of different initiatives at different agencies to diversify the applicant pool, which is really important to members of Congress, and I think really important on the merits, upgrade data reporting systems, and provide a lot of high-impact entrepreneurship training, whether it's through I-Corps, which is a program you may be familiar with, or other means. And that's just a couple of examples. So it's really allowed the agencies to do a lot of things that have, I think, on the whole, improved the applicant pool, improved the ability of small businesses to succeed. The downside is this is a pilot authority. So, it expired in 2017 and lapsed for a year and then just came back online again, but it expires again in 2020. And so a lot of agencies have told me and have told other stakeholders and have told Congress, can you please make this permanent so that, we can invest in our own capacity to do these good activities, not rely so much on external contractors, because if we don't know if it's going to be around this year or next year, we can't really invest in the long term. So it's kind of it's kind of a roundabout way of saying, if you want federal agencies to be able to serve you better, it'd be good to give them the certainty, give the agencies the certainty, to give small businesses the certainty that that these innovative outreach and management programs will be here for the long haul. So basically, this is like a two-word change in the law that says, right now it says expires in 2022. Just cut that so it never expires. Next one is more directly relevant to how small businesses spend their money. So you may recall I said earlier that traditionally, to get an SBIR award, you've got to only spend it on R&D. Over time, Congress has gradually increased the amount of your $150,000 award or your $1 million award that you can spend on non-R&D stuff. So just recently, they changed the law so that if you have a Phase 2 award, the bigger award, you can carve out $50,000 of that to do non-R&D stuff. So, if you want to hire a new employee that's going to provide technical or business expertise or commercialization assistance, you can do that, which is very helpful, or patenting, things like that aren't direct R&D. The problem is there's been some confusion in the legislative language about, well, wait a second, like, I'm a small business owner, I'm an entrepreneur, like, can I hire somebody in-house? I'd rather hire someone in-house. Do I have to use a contractor? Do I have to use only the agency favors? And so it would be very helpful if Congress said unequivocally, this is $50,000 that you, the entrepreneur, can use in your discretion on technical and business matters, whether you want to do it in-house or externally. The next thing is just award flexibility. So for reasons I don't understand, some agencies have the ability to go straight to a Phase 2, the bigger award. Some agencies compel you to go through Phase 1 before you can go to Phase 2. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. It seems like every agency should have the discretion to go straight to Phase 2 if the small business is ready for a $1 million award.
And a couple of questions relating to that, Doug. One, do you recall offhand which agencies do allow you to skip to?
I don't have it in front of me right now.
Okay. The other question is, can you just elaborate further? I have a general sense of this from the businesses we've talked to that have gotten that SBIR, but maybe give some examples to our audience of where you might be in the technology readiness level, or sort of where you might be in the stage of development of your technology that would be more appropriate for Phase 1 versus Phase 2 to help people understand the need for that.
Well, for one thing, it depends on what kind of thing. If it's a software technology, you can get pretty far on a couple $100,000 award. You can't get
most of our folks have hard technology.
You can. So I would say for most of the members on the call and in the network, the first couple $100,000, the Phase 1 is really like doing like early feasibility studies to figure out A, is this even technically possible, and B, is there even a market for it? And so just establishing those basic thresholds. Then that unlocks stages where you can really start doing real experiments.
Yeah. That's actually, I think, from a lot of the entrepreneurs we hear from, that's often the toughest stage, is that kind of the first couple of pilots or really trying to prove out the technology. They have the bench prototype, but that Phase 2 would be really helpful.
Yeah,
so.
But I mean, I think in general, it's fairly flexible. You get to define in your proposal what kind of R&D you want to do, and really, to some extent, Phase 1 and Phase 2, really up to the entrepreneur. It's really just the amount of money that's different as to what constitutes technical feasibility in R&D.
It costs money.
Yeah. The next one, again, there are these pilot authorities that are about to expire in 2022 that allow agencies to take some of their SBIR dollars and do post-Phase 2 awards, so Phase 2.2, 2.3, 2.4, and this is particularly people at NIH, where you've got, they had a company they were highlighting recently that's working on a malaria vaccine. That's not like a one-and-done consumer software play, right? So NIH is feeling like, hey, they've hit their technical milestones. they're going to need a lot more investment to get all the way through the FDA pipeline. We'd like to give them another couple $1 million through our SBIR funds. This pilot allows them to do that. Imagine, NSF doesn't do this very often, but you can imagine DOE or NASA or other agencies that are trying to pull something through a very long set of technical hurdles, wanting to bet on their winners. And so these kind of very wordily entitled pilot authorities allow agencies to, they don't mandate the agencies do that, they allow them to do that. But, there's a lot of internal paperwork involved in even getting these programs up and running, and if they're going to expire in a couple of years, a lot of agencies are like, no, thank you. So just making it permanent would actually help a lot. This next one is something we've gotten a lot of feedback about from members, and is something we really hope Congress will pay serious attention to, which is the short form application. So instead, in my case, I had to spend quite a lot of time and money and energy writing a 50-plus page application only to find out that we didn't qualify. It would have been much better if we'd been able to fill out, a short pitch, get a quick yes or no response, and then be able to move on to the full application. The National Science Foundation recently launched just this very thing. It's called the project pitch. I wish it had been around 2 years ago. But basically, you do like a 3 or 4 page proposal. In 3 weeks, you find out if it's worthwhile. It saves the entrepreneur a lot of precious time. It saves the agency a lot of time and therefore taxpayer money. So it seems like a no-brainer that Congress should encourage and or mandate all the agencies to provide this kind of quick pitch thing. Air Force is doing it too right now in its own way. And
I think it's true with SBIR, but there have been other occasional, and I think they tend to be more of the competition type DOE.
Yeah.
That once in a while we will see this approach, but I know at least one of the people on this call, I will not call you out by name, but has told me I've sent a funding opportunity to, and he said, I don't know if I want to spend $5,000 on the consultant to try to get this, and do I have the time to even apply for that? So I feel like this would be, if you only are spending 5 days or 2 weeks working on it as opposed to months.
Yeah, absolutely. Next, the next couple of suggestions are really kind of blue sky. So everything I've talked to you about so far is pretty much a constant topic of negotiation and discussion on the Hill. And there's already provisions in the law that you can kind of dial one way or the other. Next couple of ideas are like what I consider new ideas, things that aren't really in the law yet, but that seem like they would really move the needle if implemented. So one is building on what we were talking about before. Everybody is, I think, anybody who looks at this program, or frankly any government funding program, has great reason to be concerned that there's a lack of diversity in the applicant pool, whether you're looking at women-owned companies, underrepresented minorities, or regions of the country. You can imagine where things tend to trend, and it's not, reflecting the full face of diversity of the United States, regionally, ethnically, or gender-wise. And so that's despite many, 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 well-meaning efforts that have moved the needle a little bit, but not dramatically, both by Congress and by the agencies. So one idea that could really make a difference would be to create an independent program, and this could be something administered by the SBA or by a high-quality entity outside of government, to basically take really kind of neophyte first-time applicants with an emphasis on those from underrepresented groups and regions, and give them vouchers to hire a consultant to do the full application. So, so this isn't like direct cash. It's a voucher. It's basically saying, if you've made it through that project pitch, that short form application, and the agency's inviting you to make a full application, instead of having to, figure it out on your own or scrounge around for money you might not have for a high-quality consultant, here's a list of high-quality consultants on a GSA schedule or, some other, vetted way of doing it, and the SBA will pay them $5,000 to be your consultant to do your first SBIR application. And this is something that could be, I think, create a really powerful incentive for teams that, hear about the SBIR program, but then once they actually dig into the details, think, whoa, this is like not time or expertise that I have. And I can tell you this, having worked in government, we were always, saying rah-rah the praises of SBIR and going on road shows, and that's all well and good, but if you're sending people into a, super complex application process, I think, that's, marketing can only get you so far. Right, and giving people hard resources is much more compelling.
And I see this, this is very directly coupled with the prior recommendation, because you would need the short form for the technical agencies, such as the DOE or the NSF or whomever, would vet who are the applicants they want to invite back for next round, but there would be some independent entity to sort of say who has the greatest need for this assistance, which businesses are in particularly struggling. And we have one quick question here that I think might be.
Yeah.
So of all the full-blown, the long-form SBIR proposals submitted, do you have any sense of what percentage are actually funded to?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Or which agencies have higher acceptance rates than others?
That's such a good question, and let me see if I can get you all a better answer, because that might be in some of the annual reports. I tend to think they're very selective. But
I think so we just
SBIR does report this. Yeah. Before I give you a number, it's selective but not hopelessly selective. Mm-hmm. It's worth doing if you talk to the program manager and understand the program and and there's reason to believe you have a shot. It's probably easier than getting VC. Let's put it that way.
Mm.
Right.
That's really good feedback.
The VC, your chance of getting venture capital from any given venture capitalist is probably like sub 1%. Right. It's
per venture capitalist.
Right. Venture capital overall, it's hard to measure.
Right.
But yeah. Okay. Great question. So next new idea is, and in the vein of building the pipeline, is encouraging agencies to allocate some of their SBIR funding not directly to small businesses, but to really high-quality intermediaries that are kind of finishing school for we can call it science-based or hard technology, but basically what I'm talking about is not consumer software, right? Companies like those on the line here. You may have heard of some of these models that have arisen just in the last 5 years that are mostly focused on doctoral graduates and embedding them at universities or national labs. So there's one called Chain Reaction Innovations at Argonne National Lab. There's Cyclotron Road at Berkeley Lab. Oak Ridge has one. Totally independent of that, there's one called The Engine at MIT. And there's other incubators and accelerators across the country that kind of all have the mission of taking, physical science or, life science-based innovations that have a very, very high level of technical risk and getting them off the ground with scientific experts as founders. At least anecdotally, a lot of these models have generated extremely promising cohorts of SBIR applicants, much better than baseline. And so it seems like it would be worthwhile, maybe on initially a pilot basis, to allow agencies to kind of fund their own pipeline by providing support for these kinds of programs. So, and the last one is, this isn't necessarily a new idea, but right now, if you have VC funding, it's either complicated or impossible to apply for the SBIR program, and that doesn't make a great deal of, on the one hand, that doesn't make a great deal of sense because if you've been lucky enough to get funding from a private sector investor, it's because they want you to be radically successful and they've done a lot of diligence. So it's probably a good idea for the government to pile on. On the other hand, there are legitimate concerns that, well, we don't want large companies pretending to be small companies, and so there's got to be protections against that. So I think there's a way to strike a better balance by not having like a blanket ban on applicants that are majority owned by a single VC, and making it really difficult even if you have multiple VC ownership. It's kind of in the weeds, but it's one of those things that I think, if there's consensus among this group, is a good thing to push for.
Yeah, and I'd be really curious to get feedback from folks on the line or others who follow up, on the recording afterward about whether they fall into either camp, because we have heard both sides of this. Some folks saying, well, I really am so small and lack resources that somebody who already has a majority-owned VC already has a leg up. And this program should be geared towards us underdogs or the really small businesses. But on the other hand, it is something that happens during the process where, as you start to prove out the technology, it does happen that you may be acquired, majority of your equity might be acquired by a single VC. So I'd love to hear any examples from about whether they fall into either of those camps, because that will help us decide, as we speak to Congress about what's the proper way to handle this type of issue.
And I mean, just to provide full disclosure, I always thought that the kind of categorical prohibitions against VC ownership didn't make a lot of sense. But then in my own company, we chose to go through a startup studio, which occupied like a fairly big part of our capital one, with a deliberate, trade-off, because we wanted to get started faster, and we believed in their model. So, as we're thinking about applying, it's like, well, shoot, we are majority owned by a number of different entities, but those entities, some of them were small businesses, and so we kind of squeaked through the qualifications. It was really needlessly complicated. So I do kind of have a personal experience in this now.
Yeah. Your hardships with this have helped inform the recommendations.
Okay, so the next set of slides and recommendations is really less about, hey, Congress, we want you to legislate this, and more, hey, agencies, it'd be good for you to learn from each other and share some best practices. So this first one is having dedicated program managers. Again, in the weeds, but important. Different agencies run their programs very differently, and so we've seen a lot of success come from NSF and other agencies where they get dedicated program managers whose only job is to run SBIR awards, and they're not pulled in a bunch of other directions. And so, working with NSF's SBIR team often feels more like working with ARPA-E's program managers or a DARPA program manager, because you're talking about somebody who's been in the private sector, who's doing this for a limited tour of duty, and is going to, is emotionally invested in the success of their cohort from one, and can interact with you, but after the award too, it doesn't just disappear. Was there a question that just came in? Yeah,
we actually did just get, this is more feedback on the last point on the VC funding, just saying, that companies that do have significant VC funding, that the VCs can support a lot of the funding of the government proposal, sort of that the obstacle to making the proposal. So that could put folks with lower equity investors at a disadvantage. And this is, I can see both sides of this. So I think this is something, it's a matter of how do you thread the needle so you don't disqualify companies that fit in this category and yet still try to really support. I mean, the goal here is we still want to really support the really small companies that wouldn't otherwise compete for federal programs. So, it's a thing through how to design that.
The next agency level recommendation is something I showed you before. It's basically like, hey, can you please, have topics that let the entrepreneur propose the technology they are dedicated to working on, rather than really, really, really prescribed topics that an entrepreneur would have great difficulty both locating and shoehorning their ideas into. Speed and flexibility, there's a lot of variance among agencies about how long it takes to make a decision on who wins, and then how long it takes to get the award time. There are flexible authorities like prize authority that that could be used much more aggressively to shorten these award times. And then the idea of having continuous funding opportunities as opposed to just once a year is very appealing. Just a quick thing on phase 3, and we heard this from a lot of CEBN members, like there's just not a lot of awareness about, okay, great, I successfully did a phase 2 award. Now what opportunities do I have by virtue of that? And the fact is, it's a lot, but it's hard to track like all the different procurement opportunities across the federal government that are open with a kind of preference point for SBIR companies.
I've actually heard the biggest amount of complaints about this with respect to the DoD. Folks, that have kind of gotten some funding to develop something that meets the goals of a DoD program and then proven it out, and now they can't sell it back to the DoD or don't even know how to begin the process. So
right.
That's a little, frustrating because it was developed specifically with those interests in mind.
Yeah, and then I know we're running low on time, so very quickly, there's a couple of things that Congress tends to focus on, almost exclusively sometimes, that are important, but I think based on feedback we've heard, because of a difference day-to-day to small businesses than some of the other stuff we talked about. So there's kind of always a tug of war over stakeholders who want to see the set-aside increase so that it's, even more than $3 billion a year, and then other stakeholders, particularly universities, were like, no, like, this is a zero-sum game, and, we really don't want that set-aside to go. It's always a food fight, and it would be nice if Congress focused as much on some of these other improvements as on just, who wins that tug of war. And the other thing is, it'd be nice if the SBIR program overall were permanent and didn't sunset, but it's never going to lapse. Congress, no member of Congress wants to be responsible for like thousands of small businesses suddenly losing a funding stream. So it always gets reauthorized. And I doubt there's any small business owner in America who's actually biting their nails worrying about, oh my gosh, is it really going to go away in 2022? Some of the pilot authorities have gone away and will go away without action, but I mean.
Yeah, and that's one point of clarification I wanted to ask you about was, just simply by removing the sunset dates, you can get rid of that, you can make those not permanent per se, but they will exist as long as SBIR exists.
And because SBIR will always exist,
right.
Then so will
right. But we would take those other changes as well,
sure,
and they'd be great, yeah.
So in this, there's, if you really want to geek out, there's some further reading, but I'll turn it over to Lynn now.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Doug, and thank you for everyone who's taken the time to join us today. As I mentioned, this is in an ongoing process to solicit your feedback and engage you in our stakeholder process to talk to Congress and the executive branch about some potential changes, and there is great interest. So here are the next steps. So you should have in your inbox in about 2 minutes an email that's going to have a couple of links in it. One is a link to a survey that is pretty short, 10 questions, should take you less than 5 minutes to complete, but it's an opportunity for you to provide your input on your direct experiences working with the federal government. So whether you have applied for SBIR or other federal R&D programs or not, there are questions in there relevant to you. We want to know if you have navigated or tried to apply for or even successfully obtained one of these grants, and if you've not, why not? We also ask you about your experiences with different agencies because that will help us inform the recommendations to both Congress and the executive branch and for example, saying, hey, this agency seems to be doing a better job based on the input we've received. Maybe we should all look at them as a model, or these are specific challenges that people raise as being their top priorities. So please just take a few minutes while all this is fresh in your mind, regardless of whether or not you've actually successfully gotten one of these awards to provide your input. And you can put NA for the questions that aren't relevant to you, if you don't have the experience relevant to that question. And there are comment fields if you want to provide detailed comments as well. Additionally, as of now, we are launching our sign-on letter to Congress, and you will see the link to the draft letter. We do welcome your feedback on that. We've been getting feedback from various SBIR recipients and incubators and other folks, but now we do welcome your comments on that. I would like to try to get the language finalized as quickly as possible within the next day or two, so please do send back any comments on that. And we can't, there's a lot of different voices here, but we're trying our best to try to make sure that this does represent the collective feedback of the small businesses in our network. And then we would urge you to sign on to this letter. You can sign on to the draft letter as is right now if you agree with the principles, and if we make any really substantive changes, we're going to make sure we circulate the final language before we actually send it in. We're setting the deadline for September 17th, because 2 days later, there was a hearing in the House Small Business Committee specifically on SBIR. So we would like to make sure to get it to the committee in advance of that hearing. Additionally, I'm going to be testifying in a hearing just on the clean energy economy generally next Wednesday, and so I will be actually, I believe it's Tuesday. It's the 10th. So I'll mention some of these reforms more broadly and speak to some of the experiences that we've heard. Also, if you have other partners, other businesses you know who might care about these programs, feel free to share all of our materials with them. We want this to be a very open process. So if others that might provide valuable feedback, pass it along. There's my email address if you have any questions or want to send some more detailed follow-up. And then finally, as a thank you to those of you who have taken the time to listen to this webinar as well as we really appreciate those of you who are active contributors to our network and to our policy advocacy. So we're offering a promo code, which is Changemaker2019, to get 10% off a premium membership, which, as I mentioned, includes access to our funding database, where we are working to do the work of trying to compile all these funding opportunities across the various agencies, as well as some incubator competitions and some state funding opportunities, and save you the effort of doing that. So with that, I appreciate everyone taking the time to engage today, and please check your inbox for those follow-up materials that I mentioned. Thank you so much, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.